All right, then, Rachel, whenever you tell me you're ready, I'm ready.
Roll.
You're rolling. Please tell us your name.
My name is William Gingold.
Did you have a middle name?
No, I do not.
Can you please spell your first and last name?
Sure, it's William is W-I-L-L-I-A-M. Gingold is G-I-N-G-O-L-D.
What is your date of birth?
I was born on September 20th, 1939.
Where were you born?
I was born in Warsaw, Poland.
How old are you today?
Today I'm 83. In a couple of days I'll be 84.
What was your father's name?
My dad's name was Dovid. His Hebrew name, American name, David.
And where was he born?
He was also born in Warsaw, Poland.
What type of education did he receive?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, he went up to 4th grade, and that was pretty much it.
What was his occupation?
He worked at a seltzer factory. Unfortunately, I don't recall how many years he was there.
What was your mother's name?
Leah, and her maiden name was Weintal.
Can you spell that, please?
Sure, L-E-A-H.
Her maiden name?
Oh, Weintal, W-E-I-N-T-A-L.
Where was your mother born?
Also in Warsaw, Poland.
What type of education did she receive?
She never went to school.
Did she have an occupation?
Most of her unskilled labor was working in a bakery.
What language would your parents have spoken in the house?
Yiddish.
Did they also speak other languages?
Yes, my parents were very articulate in, I call them survival languages, which they picked up very quickly in the locations that we were in. But they could speak Polish, German, Russian, and my dad also could speak a little bit of Hebrew, aside from the Yiddish.
What religion were your parents?
We were all Jewish.
Do you know how your parents met?
No, I don't.
Did they live in an apartment or in a house?
They all lived in an apartment.
What was their economic status at the time?
I would say, pretty much of the general unskilled labor force in the Jewish community in Warsaw, Poland.
Were they observant?
My dad was more observant than my mother was. I would probably classify him as a conservative. My mom was probably kind of between liberal and conservatism.
Did they belong to a synagogue?
I don't know.
Did they observe any of the Jewish traditions?
Yes, pretty much almost all of them, to different degrees.
What is the name of your paternal grandparents?
My paternal grandparents were Gingolds, but I don't know their first names.
Do you know where they were born?
All of our family was born, to my knowledge, going back to my grandparents in Warsaw.
What are the names of your maternal grandparents?
Weintals. And again, I don't know their first names, and they were also born in Warsaw, Poland.
Did you have any siblings?
Yes, I did. I had two siblings, one younger and one older. The younger one was Jacob. He was about 6 years younger than I was. And my older brother was Sam. And he was about 6.5, 7 years older than I was.
Where was Sam born?
He was also born in Warsaw, Poland.
Would you know if there was any anti-Semitism in Warsaw at the time that your parents lived there and your brother was born?
Well, not directly, I would know that, but indirectly there was quite a bit. I don't think the Jewish community was ever assimilated per se in Warsaw, Poland, even though they were 1/3 of the population.
What changed for your family? What were the first signs of danger?
Well, I think my dad, I called him a hyperactive dad, really kind of had a unique skill of anticipating things. And he was also very literate, even though he only went to 4th grade. So when the rumblings of the Second World War were beginning, he was trying to figure out exactly what that meant, being close to Germany and Poland being a major target. So he was trying to anticipate exactly, to the best of his ability, I think, what was going to happen with these rumblings. So he was always thinking ahead, at least what I would gather at this point in time.
What was happening in Warsaw at the time that you were born?
Well, the Germans invaded Poland September 1st, which was really the beginning of the Second World War. And I think my dad paid very close attention to that. And he observed very carefully what was going on and what impact it might have, not only of his extended family, but also the immediate family. And of course, shortly after that, basically Germany invaded Poland. And very shortly after that, they started attacking Warsaw. And again, you know, based on what I've learned and listening to my dad occasionally, he wouldn't talk very much about it. He was anticipating that nothing good was going to happen as the Nazis were attacking Poland and Warsaw.
Were they bombing?
Oh yes, very much so. And of course, the German military was very sophisticated at that time. They had all the military power of any country in the world at that point in time. So again, the bombings, as they started in western Poland, started moving towards the east, towards Warsaw, and then Warsaw became a major target.
Was the apartment building you lived in damaged?
Well, I can't tell. We never talked about that, but a lot of the apartment buildings were damaged. And of course, as soon as Warsaw was bombed, it was kind of serendipitous that I was being born, because one day after I was born, the hospital that I was in was bombed. So I would suspect other buildings were bombed as well, including apartments and so on. And that's why I say I think my dad was anticipating major activity on the part of the Nazis. And as soon as I was born, he basically took my mother and me out of the hospital. And he, I would suspect in his own language, he sometimes swore a little bit, would say, we gotta get the hell out of here in one fashion or another, with thousands of other people that were fleeing Warsaw, pretty much trying to flee towards the east, toward the Russian sector of Poland at that point in time. And so we were part of the thousands that fled.
I'd like to go back to when your father made the decision
Sure.
to leave the apartment. Who was he with?
Oh yes, we had a very close-knit family on my mother's side, not my dad's side that I could tell. So my aunt and uncle, my aunt Rivka and my uncle Froyam were very close to my mother. They were basically on the maternal side. Rivka was, I would guess, about 17 at that time. I'm not sure exactly her age. And Froyam was, I think, probably about 21. Chava probably, not Rivka. Rivka was the wife of one of my uncles. But I apologize. But anyway, Chava was about 17. And Froyam was about 21, give or take a year. And they were very, very close to my mother, extremely close. My mother also had an older sister, and her older sister would not come with us. She wanted to see how my mom's parents were. So at that point in time, we lost all contact with mom's older sister and my grandparents.
What was her older sister's name?
I really don't recall.
How old was your brother at that time?
Well, he was about a little over 6 years older than I was, so he was probably 6.5 years of age.
When your father left the apartment with your brother, Chava and Froyam, do you know what they could take with them?
Well, very little, actually. Whatever they, again, based on the anticipation of my dad, he, had everybody put on extra clothes so they wouldn't have to carry that. And then whatever bundles they could pull with them. And the whole idea at that point in time was for that immediate unit to join the other thousands of people that were fleeing Warsaw, trying to reach the Russian encampments in the east. And again, my dad, for whatever reason, was anticipating some of the issues in fleeing, and he always tried to keep us off the road. And that was a smart thing to do, from what I heard, is the fact that German fighter planes would fly over the roads, and people that were on the roads would be machine gunned, basically. So unless you got off into the gullies on the sides of the roads or in the woods, the chances of survival was somewhat limited, I would suspect, at that point.
Let's go back to the time your father left his home.
Sure.
What other family members remained in Warsaw?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, um, my dad had brothers. I really don't know how many, because he never talked about them. He never talked about his family, per se. Uh, like I said, I think my mom's side was a little more cohesive as a family. So the grandparents were there, and whatever other family members, but we were really separated from the point when my dad took my mom and me out of the hospital to try to head towards the Russian sector of Poland.
How did he get to the hospital?
Well, I think, again, his anticipation was pretty good. He was hanging around the hospital a lot, no matter what. I think his gut feeling was right.
Was the hospital damaged?
It was totally destroyed. One day after, my mom and I were removed from the hospital.
What physical condition was your mother in when she left the hospital?
Well, like any new mom giving birth, my mom was only about 5'2" in height. I don't know how much she weighed, but on her wedding picture she looked pretty chubby. But she was a pretty gutsy lady. And we were very fortunate in the sense that I was breastfed, and she was able to do that with all of the maternal problems at that point in time.
How old were you when you left the hospital?
Well, I was a day old.
What was the weather like?
I have no idea.
Where was your father's intention? Where did he want to go with the family at this point?
Well, the whole idea was to get out of Warsaw, and to the best of his knowledge and my mother's knowledge, was to head towards the east, which was the Russian part of Poland, because they still occupied Poland, a portion of it. And the whole idea was to get to the Russian military encampments and maybe get to Russia.
Was the journey on foot?
Yes.
You mentioned that the planes were shooting down at the people.
Yes.
Were people injured or killed?
Well, the people that were on the roads, which were most of them, unfortunately, most of those people probably died by being shot by the planes that were flying over there and were machine gunning, strafing it.
Would family members need to keep running?
Well, they did the best they could. The fortunate ones, I think, were the ones similar to maybe the Gingolds, who were able to get into the woods and avoid being seen.
What was it like to be in the woods?
Well, no, I would suspect, again, I was an infant. Based on what I gather, it was not a pleasant experience. And it was getting kind of chilly. It was September, and the weather in Poland around September is fall, like in the Midwest pretty much, maybe a little colder.
How did your family get food?
Well, whatever they brought with them was pretty much the initial supply. And as they worked through the woods, they encountered farmers occasionally, and sometimes, particularly my brother Sam, he would actually go onto the farms and pick up any loose potatoes or radishes that weren't still harvested. So that was one way. And of course, we also had my aunt and uncle, who were pretty sturdy young folks at that point in time, that would also help with that process.
How long was your family in the woods?
I really don't know.
What happened when you got to the Russian border?
Well, something unexpected happened, at least to my dad's and mom's mind. We encountered the Russian military, and ironically, plus other Jewish people that, and maybe other Polish people that were fleeing, were rounded up, excuse me, and put on trucks. And as it turned out, those were German trucks as opposed to Russian trucks. And the reason for that at that point in time is that Russia and Germany had a non-aggression pact, which basically, to my understanding, was that they wouldn't go to war with each other or kill each other. And so the Russians were adhering to the pact and not letting people go into their sector. So we were put on German trucks, and then we were brought back to Warsaw. And we were brought back to a place that turned out to be the Warsaw Ghetto.
What date was that?
Well, I really don't remember the exact date. I really am blanking on the date.
Or the year?
It might have been probably, it was still probably 1939, the latter part of 1939.
Were you allowed to go back to your apartment?
No, we were not. We were placed in pretty much tenement apartments, which turned out to be the Warsaw Ghetto. We were placed in a one-room unit that had no heat, light. There was bare floors pretty much. I think the unit, the complex, shared bathrooms for all of the people within it. And so that was our start of our new quarters.
How many people were in one room?
Well, in our case, it was our immediate family. One of the things that my mother, in her mind, was always, I want to keep my family together. Excuse me. There was my dad, my mother, my uncle and my aunt, and my older brother Sam, and me. So that's a total of 6, I guess.
Where did you all sleep?
Well, we all slept together on the floor, and that's how we kept warm, and whatever clothes that we had.
Were there any doors or windows?
There was a door, at least what I, could reflect on my mother saying, and there was also a window.
What did your mother do for diapers?
Well, one of the things that I think was kind of a universal thing in the ghetto is when people died, they would basically strip the person, and usually, sad commentary here, and put the person outside on the street or by the building, but keep all of whatever clothes they had, material goods. And usually what people would do is one of the, I don't know what is the best term to use, the parents of young children, or Jews in general, is, what do I do the best for my child? And so when people died, and there were many, many reasons why in the ghetto, they would take the clothes and usually rip them apart. And for mothers that had young children, they would share the ripped clothes to be used as diapers. So that was, unfortunately, we didn't have Huggies or anything like that at that point in time.
What did you do to keep warm?
My mother. She always kept me next to her.
What did you do for food?
My mother, she breastfed me pretty much, and then she supplemented me with whatever crumbs that she was able to gather from my dad, from my uncle, my aunt, because they were all in slave labor during the day, so they received additional rations, and they always saved some of the additional rations for my mom and me and Sam.
You mentioned that they went to slave labor. What type of work were they forced to do?
Well, I'm not terribly sure because they would never talk about it. But the routine seemed to be early morning. They would be called out to get on trucks. Usually 6, 7 o'clock in the morning. And that was true for most of the adults or whoever looked like they could work, put on those trucks, and those trucks went to different manufacturing and production work camps. And I would suspect, based on the comments occasionally, what I heard from the dad, it was mostly making material for the German war effort. And the people would come back in the evening on those trucks. And to my knowledge, again, my dad or Froyam or Hava would not talk about what they did. I don't know why not, but they never did. So I don't know exactly what type of work they did per se, but it was pretty much slave labor. The positive aspect, if you can have a positive aspect to that, is they received some additional rations that people in the ghetto did not receive, that allowed them in a sneaky way to bring it back to share with whoever was in the ghetto, which included my mom and me and my brother.
Was there a way to cook or heat up food in your apartment?
No, they had some food lines. I don't know what they called them, but the food wasn't much. It was my mother occasionally described it as not a nice word, but anyway, it was some slop of some kind, usually, kind of potato grinds or beets of some kind or radishes or kind of, it was mostly kind of soup type stuff. But ironically, as I grew older, I love soup.
Was the food that was given enough to sustain people?
Well, of course, all the information that anybody has is that starvation was a single largest contributor to death in the Warsaw Ghetto. I think sometimes it's attributed to maybe 2/3 of the people that died. And then, of course, you had all kinds of other problems that attributed to that, whether it was brutality or whether it was disease. And because, there was no health care. There was no real sanitation. The amount of food that was rationed was about 1/10 of what a normal diet would be. I think a normal diet is probably in the range of 2,000 to 2,500 calories. And what I've learned is that the average ration was about 250 calories, about 1/10. So starvation was one of the major causes of death in Warsaw Ghetto.
Was your family able to get water to bathe or to wash their clothes?
Well, bathe was not an item to be discussed. It was more, can you get drinking water? And that was, there were a number of drinking stations or water stations distributed throughout the ghetto. They became fewer and fewer because one of the things that I think the Nazis intentionally planned was to basically starve people to death or have them die of natural so they wouldn't have to use other means to destroy them. So water was pretty much whatever was available was to the masses and pretty much scheduled when you could access that.
Was there lice?
I'm sorry?
Lice on the bodies?
Well, I would suspect there was because disease was pretty rampant. And I would suspect lice would be a good carrier for some of it.
Were there long lines to wait in to get rations?
Yes, there were.
How was the ghetto separated from the rest of the city?
Well, shortly after, I think it might have been early 40s, if I'm not mistaken, the Nazis decided to enclose the ghetto with a relatively tall brick wall, with the brick wall being put up by the people from the ghetto. And the brick wall had enclosed pretty much the whole ghetto. And was, again, I can only reflect some of the literature that I've read and pictures that I've seen. It must have been maybe 11 feet, give or take, tall, with barbed wire on top and shards of glass. So the intent was to keep the population inside the ghetto. And initially, the Warsaw Ghetto had 30-some entrances and exits. Once the walls were put up, it was limited to 4. So the intent was to contain the Jewish people within this 1 square mile piece of property, which is, kind of ironic because at one point in time, I think the ghetto had close to 400,000 people in it, which is kind of mind-boggling when you think about it, where you probably have to have anywhere from 7 to 10 people in one small space.
Who was guarding the ghetto?
Well, internally, I think it was kind of 3 layers from what I gathered. We had Jewish people that were sometimes, I don't recall what name they were given, but they were kind of people that encouraged other Jewish people to do things, to respond to the Polish police and then to the German military. So it was kind of a layered system. And when one didn't get, when the Jewish, I guess they were called kapos, didn't respond well, then they were mistreated by the Polish police and the Germans to the point of getting killed. So it was kind of a tiered system in terms of, I'm not sure the kapos or the Jewish, I don't know what is alternate term for a capo. They weren't really the police. They just, tried to do what the Polish soldiers or police and Nazi military told them to do, unless they wanted certain consequences, which were not very positive.
Was your brother able to attend any type of school?
No, to my knowledge, there was no school in the Warsaw Ghetto, other very informal, what the parent would do, and mostly in secret. It had to be done in secret because any communal stuff was not allowed. So my dad, I think, based on, I guess, his higher education of 4th grade, he was a quick learner and tried to teach my older brother, I think, at least some Hebrew. I'm not sure he was terribly successful at that point in time because that was not a priority. But aside from that, I think there was no formal education. Whatever education there was, it was very informal and pretty much in secret.
What did your brother Sam do all day?
Well, just like the youngsters, hundreds and maybe thousands of them, I don't know, that weren't pulled into the slave labor group, because I think he was a little too young yet. They had some defined tasks for them, both from the Jewish community and from the Nazi perspective. The Nazi perspective was very simple. Remember I mentioned before that Jewish people died in the ghetto. I think it's estimated initially that about 4,000 people died a day until we got to a very high point of 9,000 at one time or another. So the death rate was pretty high. So one of the things that the Nazis came up with was to remove the dead bodies from the ghetto. And they used the younger children that weren't trucked to slave labor as basically the corpse carriers and corpse removers. So they would allow carts to come into the ghetto And these kids, including my brother, would pick up these skeletons and some not so skeleton and put them on these carts and take the carts to the gates, and then it would be carted out. And I assume that they were either mass buried in graves, or they were cremated in one form or another.
How old was your brother when he was forced to do that?
He was about 7.
Was there any smuggling that you were aware of going on in the ghetto?
Well, the other item I was starting to mention, my mind doesn't work as quickly as it used to, unfortunately, was kind of the Jewish dictated responsibilities of young kids. And that was to help with the tunneling activities that were occurring continuously in the Warsaw Ghetto. And the tunneling was done for a number of purposes. One was to tunnel between buildings. One as a way to communicate, maybe share goods for survival, whether it's food, clothing, etc. The other purpose of the tunneling was to try to tunnel under the ghetto's walls that were built around the ghetto. And the purposes there were a couple of purposes, I think. One, that was the main route of smuggling food into the ghetto, using these tunnels that went outside, and usually the tunnels, which to some God's benefit, were always directed to the cemeteries that laid outside of the ghetto. And to a good fortune, I guess, or whatever you call it, the cemeteries were very seldom patrolled by the Nazi military. So that became kind of almost an ongoing target, is how to tunnel to the cemeteries, to the tombstones. And of course, on the other side, you had the Polish resistance fighters and some just crooks that wanted to exchange goods for different survival products. And so these tunnels were an ongoing activity, and most of the tunneling was done by these young kids with the help of whatever adults were around. And they could also crawl through the tunnels much easier because they were much smaller.
Who was digging these tunnels?
The kids and some of the older adults when at nighttime, pretty much.
Do you know if they had any tools to dig with?
Well, I would suspect they had some tools. I'm not sure. When we talk about tools, they probably had, maybe a fork and a knife kind of thing at that level of tool, and hands pretty much.
Was your father involved with building one of these tunnels?
My father was very involved with a lot of tunneling, and also trying to coordinate. He was a pre-planner, I guess, in trying to escape. His thought was always, how do we get out of here? And of course it got more and more dire the longer we were there, because the death rate kept on climbing. and that was the intent from the Nazi purpose. So anyway, so my dad was involved in quite a few things. He would never talk to me about them. Even when I was a young adult, he would talk about it. But my mom was pretty cagey, so she knew a lot of that stuff. But again, sharing information was not something that was encouraged, because you never knew who would be listening in and what the consequences would be for that information.
When your father was forced into slave labor during the day, when was he able to dig tunnels?
Oh, he did it at night when he got back. He was a tough guy, even under the worst circumstances. He was also a hyperactive adult, so he had to keep busy in one form or another, whether it was cognitive or physical. We were very fortunate.
Was he able to do any smuggling through the ghetto? Through the tunnel, rather? Did he have any contact with those outside of the ghetto?
To my knowledge, my dad did not. I think the closest would be my brother, who would have been not only a tunneler, but he would have been crawling through the tunnel to reach some of the headstones in the cemeteries where the Polish resistance people would meet up with some of the people from the inside and exchange whatever goods they had for food, pretty much. Food was really the critical thing.
Did your parents have money or something to use as a bribe for smuggling?
Well, the best to my knowledge, again, is my mom and dad used their wedding bands as part of that smuggling activity, and I don't know if they had other items of value. Again, my parents never talked about their activities during the war.
Did your little brother Sam go through these underground tunnels?
Yes, he did.
Do you know if there was any way to get outside news of what was happening to other Jewish people?
Well, like most Jewish people, the rumor mills are always great. So, I think the mechanisms were pretty much at the point where people that tunneled out to the cemetery and connected with whether it was Polish resistance people or smugglers, Polish smugglers just in for profit or whatever. That was the basis of the rumor mill. That was the best, I think, they could engender.
Were there any attempts from the Polish underground to try to get you, your brother, or other small children out of the ghetto?
Well, no, I don't think it was a Polish underground per se, but one of the things that I became aware, and it was kind of almost a slip of the tongue by my mother, because she would talk once in a while a little bit about it, but not very much, is that nurses were allowed to come into the ghetto, and I'm not sure for all of the reasons why they were allowed, but let's assume it was for humanitarian reasons, to help with healthcare issues, etc., because healthcare was non-existent basically. But some of the nurses, which eventually I think they fell into a group called the Righteous. would approach parents of young children, usually infants and toddlers. And I don't know to what extent how many of them would do that and say, that they had some potential abilities. So I would assume they may have some connections with the Polish resistance outside. That we can take your child and, looking at the dire situation in the ghetto, maybe save your child by having your child be adopted by a Christian family, or being maybe smuggled out of Poland to another country where it would be safer for the Jewish people and Jewish children especially. So that was one of the things that they approached my mom. And as I mentioned previously, my mom had a very strong attitude about keeping the family together. And my dad would never argue about that. And she refused to do that. And that happened on a couple of occasions when these nurses came. And I think twice she turned them down. At least that's what I've learned. There was a third time, but that was with a Russian soldier.
Was religion suppressed in the ghetto?
Well, my dad was, like I said, I think more the conservative. So he practiced more than my mom did. My mom became conservative when she was older, but not while we were in the ghetto or fleeing or in the DP camps. But my dad retained his conservative Judaism, at least whatever he could practice. He would occasionally, in secret, meet with other Jews, and they would have some kind of service. I don't know what the details of that were, or where they met. But he was usually one of the leaders to try to pull that together. And I would suspect they must have had a lot of arguments about meeting, not meeting, doing what they were doing, not doing, etc. But my dad wouldn't talk about that. It was only through my mom's little comments that I would learn about that.
Did you ever have a bris?
Yes, I did.
In the ghetto?
In the ghetto. My dad insisted on it, and somehow he pulled it off.
Do you know any details about your bris?
I sure don't. He wouldn't talk about it.
Were you given a Hebrew name?
Yes. Baruch, which I think means bless you. Excuse me. I'm ready to go again.
Getting back to the tunnels, where do you think all the dirt was collected after the tunnels were dug?
Well, they carried a lot of it into apartments and wherever they could find space to unload it, pretty much. And that's one of the reasons the tunnels were relatively small in diameter, that mostly kids could crawl through, or some very skinny adult.
Was there any light in the tunnel?
No.
Do you know how it was supported to keep it from collapsing?
Well, it was small tunnels, so I don't think they needed to build any girding, I would suspect. That's what I'm assuming. I don't personally know that.
Did Sam make frequent trips in this tunnel?
I don't know. I don't know how frequent they were, or how many. Sam wouldn't talk about that either. He started talking about that when he was in his early 80s, unfortunately.
Was your father's goal to escape the Warsaw Ghetto?
Continuously. He saw what was happening within the confines of the ghetto, and he felt we really didn't have a lot of time left for anybody in the ghetto. So he made whatever efforts for escaping that he could.
Was his plan for your family to escape through the tunnel?
Yes, it was.
Did that happen?
Yes, it did.
Can you talk about how your family escaped the ghetto?
Well, I personally can't, other than it was through the tunneling system. Whether it was, the tunnels that my dad and Sam worked on or not, I don't know. Well, we had another attempted escape, aside from the tunneling, that preceded the tunneling effort, which, again, being an old guy, my memory doesn't work too well. But I think one of the escapes that we had, attempted escapes, was through the sewers of Warsaw. Warsaw was a very sophisticated city. I think it was one of the more sophisticated cities in Europe, but prior to the Second World War. And their tunneling their sewer system was, one of the better ones. So my dad and some other families pulled us together with the intent of trying to get out of the ghetto under the tunnels, under the sewer system. And unfortunately, someone forgot to put the sewer lid on one of the things, and the Nazi patrols noticed that. And as soon as they did that, they started basically firing into the sewers, machine gunning the sewers. And the people that were able to retrieve back to where they came from were probably the survivors, which included the Gingolds. I don't know about all the other families. I'm sure some other families survived as well. But it was not a very good, successful effort, unfortunately.
What would it have been like in the sewers at that time? What were the conditions down there?
Well, I don't know what conditions are in the sewers, with all honesty. I was a little kid. I don't have any recollection at all of that event, other than what I've learned from my family.
Do you know how your mother would have kept you quiet?
Oh yeah, that's. I learned that when I was a young adult. Interestingly enough, I used to take my mother out for lunch periodically, and we would just chit-chat. My dad was too hyperactive to go out for lunch. Anyway, one of the things I noticed when we would finish the lunch is that she would take out a handkerchief, or if she didn't have one with her, she would take a large napkin or whatever was there, and she would start taking stuff off the table, such as any sugar packets. If there were sugar cubes, she would take, let's say, those little packets of, what do you call them, marmalade, or anything that was small in nature, that was food to her perception, she would take, and she put wrap it up in her handkerchief or napkin and put it in her purse. And I was always embarrassed to ask, why the heck are you doing that? We're in good shape here. And anyway, as it turned out, I learned that, let me just regress just 1 second here. So the next time I came to visit her, she would have this handkerchief with her, and she would give me that, the contents of it. And I said, well, I'm an independent living adult. I don't think I need, a sugar cube and etc. But I was too embarrassed to ask her why she was giving me that. And interestingly enough, when my nephew Jeffrey wrote the book about the Gingold's, primarily about the Gingold family and Sam in particular, when he wouldn't share any of the information over the number of years that he collected data and did research with us ahead of time. We had first glance at the information when the book was published. So when I read the book, I learned that Lily, or Leah, or Mom, was doing the same thing throughout all the years in the ghetto and while we were traveling in our whatever escape efforts. She would always put things into a handkerchief, particularly sugar cubes at that time. And as we were fleeing and we're at different sites where people had to be quiet, not to be detected. And being a young child, you don't discuss that. You just make sounds whenever you want to. She would take a handkerchief with usually sugar and plop it in my mouth to keep me quiet. And that's how a number of times we avoided the German patrols when we were fleeing through the woods and some of the farms.
Describe the escape through the tunnel, who was with you?
Yeah, I think, to the best of my knowledge, it was my mom, my dad, Sam, um, my aunt, and my uncle, because my mom insisted to keep our family together, no matter where we went. And I don't know exactly, how they managed all of that, with all honesty. But they were able to get out through the tunnels in one form or another. And basically, apparently we weren't the only ones. There were other families that did similar things. And they dispersed pretty much in the cemeteries and went whatever way they thought they wanted to go. And again, I kind of give a lot of credit to my dad. He knew something about geography and directionality. And so we followed his sense. And again, the direction was to get to the Russian border.
How long had your family been in the Warsaw Ghetto?
I would guess almost about 2.5 years. Yeah, pretty close to that.
What happened once your family crawled out of the tunnel into the cemetery?
Yeah, well, the families, the ones that did the same thing that we did, dispersed. We followed the lead of my dad, and we headed through the woods because he thought that was the safest way to try to get to the Russian border, and basically traveled mostly at night. And my uncle was kind of the scout, if you will. He would be kind of, when it was time to try to find a place to lay down for the rest of the night, he would be the one to go ahead of the other Gingolds and try to locate a farm and then approach the farmers and see if they would be willing to help a Jewish family. And that was a big risk that he took, tremendous risk, because some of the farmers were not receptive to doing that for a lot of reasons. Mostly that if they were caught helping Jews, they would be treated just like the Jews by the Nazis. So some of them, like most of them, I would suspect, showed reluctance to do that. But yet there were some that he found that were willing to help. The ones that weren't, sometimes he had to fight them off because they wanted to keep him as a hostage to give to the Nazi patrols. But he was a pretty husky guy. So anyway, he was our scout, and we were very fortunate as we moved through the woods, forests, to encounter some farmers that were willing to help at their own risk. And that's what it was.
Do you remember the name of any farmers who helped you?
No, I don't, but I'm sure my parents and my brother probably, if I read the book, I would probably, one was Lek and the other one was Basha, and there were some other ones that we just don't have the names.
How did Lek and Basha help you? What did they do for you?
Well, again, I was a little kid, so everything is kind of secondary information and maybe tertiary information as well.
Did they give you shelter?
They gave us shelter, they gave us food, they treated us extremely well. And they give us food for our journey as well. And some guidance in terms of where to go next in the woods.
Did you sleep in their farmhouse?
Yes, we slept usually in their barns, usually in their hay if they had usually most of them wound up not having animals because the German military confiscated those when they made their patrols. So these farmers were in trouble as well, you know. So it was very unusual that you would find farmers that would be willing to help, because they were not, you know, farmers that had all the luxuries that one would want.
Was the family able to stay warm while hiding in a barn?
Yeah, they usually provided blankets. They provided food, the ones that would take us in. I mean, they were really courageous people to take the chance to help Jewish people, because we couldn't give them anything other than a thank you.
Was there ever a time that Germans came looking for you?
Well, I think they came looking for us all the time. I don't know if they were looking for the Gingold specifically, but they were always looking, patrolling, to see if they could find Jewish people. So I guess it wasn't unusual for them to go to these farms on a regular basis almost.
Was there ever a time that your family was almost discovered?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
Then what happened after you were going from farm to farm?
Well, we were able to reach the Russian encampments, and at that time, the non-aggression treaty was broken already, and Russia and Germany were at war with each other. So basically, we encountered the Russians. I don't know how long we stayed before we were loaded on trucks. I never got that information. But the Russians seem to have been very receptive to trying to help. And then I found out, well, they had a reason to be receptive. They needed labor. But I'm sure there were other intrinsic thoughts there. So we encountered the Russian military, and that's where my third potential sale was, of Bill Gingold or Baruch Gingold, where one of the military officers approached my mother. And I don't know why. And at that point in time, I was, I think, about 3 years of age. And he wanted to keep me. But my mother, but it was on a positive note, not a negative kind of thing. And my mother again, for the third time, kind of said, "No, I'm not interested," basically. So that's the way it was. I could have been a Russian colonel by this time. I don't know.
What did the Russians do with you?
Well, they put us on Russian trucks this time because they were at war with Germany. And I don't know how long these trucks took all of these people that were fleeing, that hit their encampment. And these trucks took us to trains, to boxcars. And we were put on these boxcars, but the boxcars here were a little different than the German ones. They had straw on them, they had blankets, they had food available, some heating mechanisms. I mean, they were similar outside, but inside they were different. And this is where my aunt Hava and my uncle Ephraim got separated from us. Was at the trains. So we, when I say we, it was mostly my mom, dad, Sam, and I got separated from my aunt and uncle, and we wound up on a different train. And we wound up, at least the more immediate family, wound up going to Siberia.
Were you told where you were going?
I would suspect they probably were. No one ever verbalized that to me. But the reason, I suspect is that the trains would stop pretty frequently and would let the people off the trains to go to the bathroom. And interestingly enough, I must have been a little over 3 years of age, I think. That's really my first recollection, memory that I have.
Do you have any memories of the time on that boxcar?
Yeah, probably my first memory, I think, as a person, would be my experience with the boxcar. I remember that we were allowed to be unloaded from the boxcars, and we stopped in a snow desert. It was basically just miles and miles of snow that you could see. So we were getting close to Siberia. And one of the soldiers, Russian soldiers, took me off the boxcar to put me on the snow as a kid. And there were other kids around. So that was my first exposure to other children, ironically. When I was over 3 years of age. And the other thing that I had as a positive experience is that we were playing with other kids, throwing snow at each other, which was kind of positive. The other thing, which I don't know exactly whether that memory was triggered at that point or a combination of points, that when I looked at the Russian soldiers, I noticed all of them had rifles, just like the Germans did. But their rifles were always pointing into the ground. And what I've always kind of observed in pictures and photographs and other information is that the Germans always pointed their weapon at people. Those were my first two memories as a child, which is scary almost. One is very positive and the other one is kind of strange. And I don't know how you interpret memories, but that's the way it is.
Do you know how long your family was on the boxcar?
I'm sure it must have been, either a combination on trucks and boxcars, a couple of weeks for sure. Because we wound up going to a lumber camp in northern Siberia, from what I learned. So the trip was a long one, but it didn't seem to be problematic. I don't think. I was always close to my mother. She always kept me next to her. I don't know what my brother was doing. And my dad, who the heck knows? He was a hyperactive adult.
How would you describe your dad physically?
Well, he was about 6'2". My mom was about a foot shorter. Very tough looking. When he didn't shave a couple of days, he really looked tough. I could never keep up walking with him because he walked so fast. Even as an adult, I had to run to keep up with him. He would be quiet most of the time, but then when he talked, you really had to listen for some reason. He got your attention. But he wouldn't talk very much, at least, as I was growing up. Of course, I didn't see him that much either because both of my parents worked full time. So I was pretty much on my own as a young teenager. But, I think he was kind of a mix of, it's hard to describe. He seemed very religious, yet was very down to earth in terms of realities. He didn't spend time talking about the Testament or the Talmud, but yet he seemed, whenever we had any holidays, even when we couldn't celebrate them, he always had some comment about it. So those are the recollections of my dad. He died when he was relatively young. He was, I think, 76.
When you arrived in Siberia, what was the housing situation?
Yeah, they were kind of barracks type that I can best understand. And what they did is they usually put 4 families in one barracks, and they would divide the space by sheets. So you had visual separation, a visual space separation, but not sound separation. And usually the heating element was right in the middle of the barracks. And of course, you had a lot of wood, being in a lumber camp. And the kids were pretty much on their own because the parents, all adults that were capable of labor, wound up working in the lumber mills. And interestingly enough, they were actually paid a small amount to do the work. They couldn't call their own job in terms of, I want a day off kind of thing. There weren't any military. There were people that had rifles there, but they were lay people, to my knowledge. And they weren't there to guard anybody from escaping or leaving the camp because, for one, that part of Siberia has only 1 month during the year that's above 32 degrees. So running away in the woods with 16, 19-foot snow drifts, and pretty much below freezing at all times was not something anybody wanted to do. At least I wasn't aware of any information that would lead me to say that anybody ever tried to run away from a lumber camp. And of course, you also had the bears. So it wasn't just the weather, but also the scavengers that you had for food.
Can you describe the work that your parents did?
Well, I don't know exactly what people do in a lumber mill, but they were cutting woods, trees. They were making planks because there was a lot of sawdust, and my dad and mom would usually bring some sawdust into the barracks and would give it to Sam, interestingly enough. And Sam would use that. He would put that on the floor because all of the kids, there weren't any adults there. So all of the kids had to take care of each other. So the older kids wound up being the caretakers and the tutors and the teachers of the younger kids. And what the older kids would do is take the sawdust and, as an example, my brother, I don't know what other kids did, would take a stick and basically draw in the sawdust to teach me different symbols and letters. I don't know if it were letters or what. I was too young to discriminate that. But it was really kind of my teacher. And that's the way the other kids got maybe their stimulation in some form or another. But the parents usually got up very early in the morning to go through the drifts that were dug out, because the drifts were anywhere from, like I said, maybe 9, 10 feet to 16, 19 feet tall. So they covered the range of the barracks. And it was interesting because the adults, and I don't know if they were the Russian who were running the camps or the people, the Jewish people, would always clear the windows of the barracks from these drifts so we could look out and see where our parents or adults were going or family members were going. And that was something that I always did, looking for Mom. But in terms of the labor that they did, they worked pretty much all day. They started early in the morning and usually came back in the evening, maybe 5, 6 kind of thing. So they had a 10, 12-hour day. And they worked at the mill, doing whatever lumber mills do.
Were they able to keep warm?
Yeah, they kept, the stoves were going 24 hours a day. Like I said, I think almost all of the units had a central wood-burning unit. And lumber was, a continuous inflow. And again, listening to my mom, usually some adult, and I don't know how they took turns, would at night feed the stove so it wouldn't go out, kind of thing. So it was always warm in the building, or barracks.
How long was your family in Siberia?
I'm guessing maybe less than a year, close to a year. And I don't know how the decision was made to allow people to leave. I'm making an assumption, and I don't have any real knowledge, that maybe they allowed families to leave, because families were kind of a pain in the hinder, I think, having kids there that they had to worry about. But anyway, we were given Russian papers that allowed us to travel through Russia.
Before
Yeah.
we learn about
Yeah.
the time you left the camp, while your family was at the camp, did they make any friends?
Not to my knowledge.
Was there any way to find out what happened to Chava and Froim?
We didn't find that out until after we came to the United States, and we were here a few years. So my dad did some research at that point in time.
Was your family able to keep up any Jewish traditions while there?
Well, my dad, like I said, would practice davening on his own. I don't think he had any material to daven from, but he had a pretty good, darn good memory. My mom, I don't think, was interested in any of that.
Were you aware when it was Shabbat?
I wasn't, and I was never told when it was. No, I don't have any recollection of Shabbat and the lumber camps as a youngster.
So you don't know if your mother was ever able to light Shabbat candles?
I would suspect no, because I'm not sure the candles were there. But it's just my intuition. I have no knowledge as such.
What year were you in that labor camp in Siberia?
Oh, wow. I have it written down, but I don't remember. We were there probably less than a year. So it must have been 42. I'm sorry, I just don't remember exactly. I have a chronology written down, but I don't have it with me here. I apologize.
Tell me about the journey leaving Siberia.
We were given papers to allow us to travel through Russia. And it was a very, to me, it was just almost a mind-blowing experience, because we were able to use a train. We were able to eat food without worrying about it, because when they were in the lumber camps, they received payment, as small as amount. They gave them that amount of what they earned. So my parents had some money with them as we traveled through Russia. And they also, I think, tried to work on farms as laborers during the travel time. But it was a real exploratory thing for me as a child, being on a train, seeing landscapes, etc. I have memories of that. I have memories of the train. This was a passenger train, actually, not a boxcar. So I have a positive affinity now for trains, based on that, I think. So we traveled through Russia. I don't know for how long, but we wound up eventually going to Kazakhstan, which was at that time, I think, kind of a Russian satellite or country or union, part of their union. My dad was able to find work there. I think he worked, if I'm not mistaken, in a military factory that made boots and things like that. I'm not 100% sure, but for some reason that sticks in my mind. And my mom became an entrepreneur, I hate to use that term, on the market, open markets, where she kind of learned how to negotiate with people and at the same time watch over her two kids that she had with her at the market. And she became very good at that. And for some wonderful reasons, my parents were able to pick up languages pretty easily. I call them survival languages, because they seemed to learn the language in the environment that we had to survive in very quickly, at least the right words for whatever reason. So my mom became very, very astute in the market. She wound up having her own stand, I don't know, table or whatever. And somehow she wound up having goods that she bartered with and sold. My dad, on the other hand, worked at the factory, and I think he got paid. So they had some monies.
What was your mother selling?
Again, she became an astute negotiator. She would rise up real early before the markets even opened, because I would always, wherever we lived, if there was a window, I would always watch her leaving. She would go to farmers and basically get chickens, eggs, whatever she could barter for. And after a time, she got pretty good at it. I don't know, what initially she used to barter for. Maybe my dad's meager pay or whatever. But she came very good at it. And Sam and I were just running around like chickens without our heads, having fun to the extent that we could, without getting beat up too often.
Was it safe for Jewish people in Kazakhstan?
No, Kazakhstan was pretty anti-Semitic by and large. But they kind of liked my mom. One, she was a little woman. And she seemed to be pretty fair with people. So whatever, happened in the marketplace, she had a little support system. I'm not sure a lot, but some. I think the reason I say that Kazakhstan might have been anti-Semitic is that in Kazakhstan, my dad was picked up by the police and put in prison because someone suggested that he might have stolen something from the military manufacturer, from the boot company that he worked in. So we lost my dad for probably about 6 to 9 months. So my mom had to struggle on her own with Sam and May and just the survival. And she was pretty, like I said, pretty astute. She must have made some reasonable connections on the market where we were able to stay with other people while my dad was away partying. No, I'm just kidding. He was in prison somewhere. We didn't know where he was. My mom tried to find out. So my mom struggled for quite a few months until one day my dad showed up. Unexpectedly, he found us. And I later learned that he was let out of prison, and because they didn't know why he was there to begin with, they didn't have any documentation on him or anything that would suggest why he should be there. So they needed more space for others. So it was just luck, if anything, because he didn't do anything to deserve it, really, one way or another. So we were very fortunate and very lucky to reconnect because he was pretty astute in his geography.
Did he say how he was treated in prison?
No.
When your mom would go to inquire, was she given any information about him?
No, she went to the police stations. That was only recourse, really. And they either wouldn't tell her or they didn't know.
While in Kazakhstan, where were you living?
Well, we were living, I think, with another family. I have no recollection, personally, of that family, but they must have been somewhat supportive of us. But personally, I just don't have any information.
When did you leave Kazakhstan?
Oh, God. I wish I had my chronology in front of me. We must have been in Kazakhstan until the time probably when we heard that Hitler died and the war ended. Because I hope I'm right on that. That's what's coming to my mind. Because at that point in time, Russia gave us papers that allowed us to leave Russia and their satellites. And that's when we started journeying back to Poland with the intent, at least from what I learned from my parents, of trying to find any living relatives that may have survived in Poland. And on that track, basically they learned that no one was alive that they knew of, or anybody knew of. And we had all kinds of experiences, I should say, traveling through Poland. And as we were traveling through Poland in different ways, we heard through the rumor mill that if we could get to Berlin, Germany, to the occupied section by the United States, I guess at that point in time they divided between the Allied forces, the city of Berlin, into sectors. If we could get somehow to Berlin, to the American sector, there might be organizations that would help displaced people. So my parents' goal pretty much was get to Berlin, whatever it takes. And there were some harsh experiences during that travel, but we made it to Berlin.
While you were traveling in Poland, was your goal to go back to Warsaw?
Yeah, that was the intent, but I don't think they ever made it back to Warsaw.
Do you know how Jewish people that were returning to Poland were treated?
The anti-Semitism was pretty high. I mean, all the way through Poland. It wasn't just, in Warsaw. A matter of fact, as an adult, when my parents would say something negative about their experiences, we were in a comfortable environment at that point in time. They had more negative comments about the Polish people that they encountered, aside from the righteous folks that helped us out, than the Germans. It just fascinated me, and I don't understand it, that the Jewish people, after the war, did not have any inclination of vengeance of the Germans. And I get that question asked quite a few times when I occasionally get to talk about the Holocaust. But anyway, that's so we wound up in Berlin.
How did you get to Berlin?
All by hook and by crook, I would suspect. I think it was by walking, boats. I don't think we were ever on a train going to Berlin. It was always, either kind of hitchhiking, by smugglers, by boat where we had to cross rivers, etc. But it was really a real mix. I really don't recall, all the sequences there. Because, things changed almost every day. What I do remember in towns or cities that we went through, that my older brother Sam and I would forage a lot, because I was old enough to go with him. We would go to dumps, garbage dumps, and see what we could get out of there. And on occasion, my mom and dad would find work, small jobs, as we traveled. So it was a real mix. There wasn't anything stable that I remember during that time. It was always on the go, stop here, do something, move on. Yeah. But to me, as a kid, it was like an adventure. I saw the garbage dumps as fun. I'm sure my parents didn't see it that way, or Sam, because he was old enough to discern that we were in a deep heap.
Were you ever taken on trucks?
Yeah, I'm sure we were, but it was closer to Berlin that we were picked up by trucks by the American soldiers that were outside of Berlin. But all I remember is being on a huge truck with tons of people on there, and it was raining, and everybody was getting soaked. That's all I remember as a kid. That was my experience.
When did you encounter the Americans?
Well, we wound up, let's see, it must have been, I don't know whether it was 45 or late 45. We encountered the soldiers in Berlin. And one of the things, I learned is that they do give away Hershey candies because I was a recipient, because I think almost every soldier that saw a little kid would give candy to that kid. And that kind of triggered my sweet tooth forever. And it was probably coupled with the sugar cubes that my mother fed me.
What happened once you got to Berlin?
Well, we were in Berlin. We were put in a housing complex that wasn't bombed out yet. And my mom and dad found some work. Each one of them found some work. And Sam and I, my older brother and I, were on our own. And I guess in a positive context, I can say we explored the American sector of Berlin as two kids. And one of the ironies I remember was because we scavenged in garbage, even in Berlin, we were in a garbage truck, the two of us, sorting through the garbage, and the truck started moving. So we learned not to go into garbage trucks. But the other thing that was kind of in my memory is when prior, and this is what I've learned, that's coupled with reality, I guess, is prior to the war, my brother Sam, with the help of my dad, built a scooter that was really the prized item for Sam.
Was this in Poland?
This was in Warsaw, Poland, prior to us winding up in the Warsaw Ghetto. And the reason I even bring it up is when Sam and I were on our own in Berlin, that's the first thing that Sam and I did was put together scooters from the parts that we found in our garbage dumping.
While in Berlin, were you in a DP camp?
No, no, we were not in a DP camp in Berlin. We were in a kind of a guarded array of buildings. I don't know if they were apartment complexes, but we were free to leave these buildings because they were under the American military auspices. We were in Berlin a relatively short period of time. I think maybe about 6 months or less. And at that point in time, they connected us with the different agencies that were working in Berlin to try to resettle displaced people from Europe. And at that time, the most convenient placement for people were these DP camps that were established, probably a couple of dozen or close to that. I don't know the exact number. And so we were sent to one of those camps, and the one we were sent to was a place called Fehrenwald, which was very close to kind of a metropolitan city called München. just maybe 20 miles away or less of that. I don't know. And that camp was at one time a military housing complex. So they were basically barracks, quite a few of them. And the American military authority was in charge of that particular one. They may have been in charge of many other ones, but I'm not familiar with that, with the DP system. But this was one of the larger DP camps. At one time, it had even up to about 5,000 people. And over a very relatively short period of time, the American authorities allowed the Jewish people in the camp. And initially, it wasn't all Jewish, the Fahrenwald. It might have been like maybe 90% or 80% Jewish people, and then the others were other displaced people, Polish, some maybe Slovakian, Czech, etc. But over just a short period of time, it became pretty much all Jewish. And the military administration started signing over governance to that camp to the Jews. And the first thing that the Jewish people did, and it was driven by the Orthodox Jews, pretty much, they took control initially of these camps. At least Fahrenwald they did. I don't know about the other ones. And they started setting up their Orthodox system of yeshivas, schooling, etc. And so that's gradually, and over time, it got a little more secular in terms of other things like sports and social activities, theater, movies, etc. And we were at Fahrenwald almost 6 years, approximately 6 years. I'm not sure about the dates anymore. We were some of the last DPs from Fahrenwald to leave that camp. I think the camp probably closed a year later. And from that camp, we wound up, I think it was random numbers, to the best of my knowledge, maybe some other, if you had family somewhere, then, maybe you were heading in that direction where you had family, but we didn't know of any family. So we were really random numbers. And so I think there were 3 choices from Fahrenwald, maybe more, but I think one was Argentina, one was Israel, and one was the United States. And we wound up on the United States list.
While in Fahrenwald, did you attend school?
No.
Did you have a bar mitzvah?
No. But my brother Sam did. I'm sorry to say, for some reason, I couldn't buy into the yeshiva. I would not respond to Orthodox Jews. And I refused to go to school. And my mom said, okay.
What language did you speak in that camp?
Mostly Yiddish. We spoke some German because we dealt with the German community outside the camp, particularly my mom. Um, and my dad again picked up the language very quickly. For he had a gift for learning at least what I call survival languages.
Were babies born in the camp?
Oh yeah, I mean Fehrenwald was a very productive camp. The first year, I think, from the time we were there until my young brother was born, he was part of that productive group. 250 babies were born in 1 year on a population of less than 4,000. So my brother, younger brother Jacob, was born in Fehrenwald.
Did you have someone sponsor you to come to the United States?
No, we were not sponsored. We were part of the random number of displaced people going to different countries. And it was our fortune to be selected for United States.
How did you get to this country?
Well, it was pretty easy from the camp, from the DP camp. They transported us to Bremerhaven, which was one of the ports. And at that time, of course, they had military transport ships in the German waters. So we were put on one of the military transports, just like other families were put on there. Matter of fact, we actually have a picture of that ship because we were able to identify it. So we left from Bremerhaven or Hamburg area to the United States on a transport, military transport. And I think it took a couple of weeks to cross the Atlantic Ocean. And we arrived sailing through the Statue of Liberty Island there, and arriving at Ellis Island in New York, like millions of others did, before and after us even.
When did you arrive in the U.S.?
I think we arrived in May of 1951, somewhere around there. I hope I'm guessing right. So the dates don't stick in my mind very frequently, but yeah, so we arrived, we went through all of the procedures of Ellis Island being deloused, which I remember distinctly as a kid.
What was that like?
Well, it was a little scary for initially, because what you did is groups of people wound up going into this bare room, which for some adults was like going into gas chambers, especially if they came, they were Jews. And they would spray us left and right to delouse us. The only thing, they didn't have this gas stuff from the ceilings. But it was kind of the same kind of looking rooms. But the people were positive about it. It was, in a positive context. No one was carried out on a stretcher or anything. So, and to kids, it was just a wonder. What the heck are we with all these people getting sprayed for what? Yeah. But that's the eyes of a child.
What were your first impressions of the country?
Well, I saw the Statue of Liberty. I didn't know what it was initially. Until later, as a young teenager, someone mentioned it to me. We had a lot of fun on the ship for the people that didn't get seasick. I remember all of the able adults had to work on the ship. My dad wound up painting the outside of the ship as it was moving. I remember him waving to us as he was painting. So to the kids, it was a free-for-all, really. If you didn't get seasick, it was fun. I think almost every adult got seasick because it was crowded quarters. The sleeping quarters were bunks 5 high. So if you had to go to the bathroom, there were problems. But anyway, but it was a relative for a child, such as myself at that point. It was fun. It was adventure. I didn't see any downside to it.
Where did your family settle?
Well, based on the skill level of my parents, because they were both regarded as unskilled laborers. When we got to Ellis Island, I don't know who made decisions where you go, but I think one of the decision points was where can these people get jobs right away, since they're not sponsored? And what social service agencies will help them. I think those might have been some of the criteria that the people that made some decisions there. And I think because of my parents not having any training or skills per se, other than survival skills, we were sent to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, because at that time, Milwaukee was a high manufacturing city that had a need for a lot of unskilled labor. The jobs were plentiful in Milwaukee. And when we got to Milwaukee, my parents immediately almost got jobs. So Sam and I were pretty much on our own again. So my mom wound up working in a bakery, and my dad wound up working in a steel mill. And that's pretty much their whole lives. Each one worked in those respective areas.
How did they learn the language?
Oh, that was a challenge too, because I never went to school before coming to the United States. So, but we were fortunate. We came to the United States during the summer, basically. And I can't recall the social service agency or agencies that worked with us. I think one might have been the Milwaukee Jewish Vocational Service, if I'm not mistaken. But there was another one, but I can't recall. And both of those agencies helped find housing for us. They helped us establish a household, I guess. They provided us with eating utensils, I'm sure some money for my parents to buy food, etc. And maybe some instruction to my parents, which I don't know. But for Sam and May, we were kind of left on our own. And like I said, my parents wound up working relatively soon after we came to the country.
How did they learn the language?
Both of them struggled with English. My dad was able to pick it up okay. He had a very heavy accent no matter what language he talked. And my mom was never able to learn English. She spoke, like I said, survival English. She would have been great having a daughter rather than a son, because then I think she would have learned the language. But we were starting to get, as a teenager, Sam was a young adult almost, and I was a teenager, so we didn't pay too much attention to our parents per se. But we were assigned a tutor because we were here during the summer. Yeah, I think maybe a couple of hours a week kind of thing. And Sam didn't stay with the tutoring very long. He decided he wanted to work. And he seemed to have found a job. I don't remember what was his first job. But he had some skills that he learned in the DP camps. The watchmaking skills, actually. He was trained in watchmaking and watch repair. I don't think he ever used it in the United States, to my knowledge. At least he never mentioned it to me. So I don't know what work he started, and I was kind of left pretty much on my own. I was being tutored, and then one day, and I don't know who suggested that to me, they said, are you familiar with movies? And I superficially was, because at the DP camps, they would show Walt Disney movies. And so I saw Walt Disney films at the DP camp. So anyway, my mom somehow came up with the idea to keep me busy, that if you're not being tutored, you got to find something else to do. And I must have been, about 12 years of age at that time. And Sam was somewhere. So she said, well, why don't you see if you can go to the movies sometimes during the day while I'm working. So, okay. So she would prepare some food for me. She would give me, I don't know, whatever amount of money I needed to catch a bus in Milwaukee, because all of the movie theaters were in downtown Milwaukee. And I would get this lunch, maybe pack a lunch, maybe 10:30 in the morning to take with me. I would take the bus, because I did this so regularly after a while. That sticks in my mind very clearly. I would go to these movies that would open up showing films at about 11 o'clock in the morning, and they would cycle these films, repeat the films throughout the day until about 11 o'clock at night when they closed. And I would sit there with my lunch, or whatever it was, and I would watch these movies, anywhere from 4 to 6 hours a day. And most of the movies that I wound up watching were Western cowboy movies. So I started picking up the slang that they were using. And I would bring that back to the tutors, and they would correct me and say, this is what you need to do, etc. So anyway, we plodded along that way until I started school in the fall. At that time, I kind of lost sight of my brother, because he was working. He was a young adult on his own. I was living with parents, and okay, backtracking. Where would you want me to backtrack?
were talking about the movies.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Okay, maybe I can take a drink at this point, huh? Okay, so I started, as I was going to these movies, I was picking up the language a little bit from the action scenes, etc. And most of them were cowboy movies. And then the other fortunate part was when we were settled in Milwaukee, we were settled in a very poor neighborhood. So we were next to a church that had a thrift store. And my parents and I used to go to that thrift store because that's where we shopped on occasion. But I used to go there whenever I had free time because they had a huge collection of comic books. And I was there almost every day that I could be there. And I would study comic books. I couldn't read the language, but I would study them and try to associate what they were saying in their little clouds to the people's faces. And I would jot down those words that were in heavy print. And then I would show them to my tutor and say, what does this word mean? And that's how I started learning some of the words of English. But anyway, by that time, it got to be fall. And I was supposed to start school. I didn't have any school records of any kind. So this was also a learning experience for me. Because almost all of this I had to do on my own, because my parents weren't around. So anyway, I wound up being scheduled, because I didn't have any records, so they wanted to get some knowledge about me in terms of reading, writing, and arithmetic, I assumed. So they gave me some standardized tests. And of course, I couldn't respond to it. I could do some of the arithmetic because I could decipher the digits and the plus signs, minus stuff, but I couldn't do anything else. So at that point in time, I was referred to psychological services to be evaluated for special education at that time. And this was already in the school building at that time. And I was scheduled to see the psychologist to have a psychological assessment. And I think the principal or the counselor, I don't know who, walked in and kind of talked to the psychologist saying, "Are you aware that he doesn't understand English?" So the testing that he did, I guess, was invalid. Let me put it that way, because he was recommending to place me in classes for the mentally retarded because of the testing. But it was intercepted by a counselor or principal that knew I was a foreigner, that I didn't know English at all. But anyway, so I started school, learning the ABCs basically. They gave me a lot of special educational activities. I wound up having a couple of good friends. As I mentioned to you, we kind of lived in a very, it was the Black Ghetto of Milwaukee, actually.
Were there other survivor families in your community?
Not to our knowledge. So most of my friends in the neighborhood before we started school, as well as starting school, were mostly black kids. because there were very few white children at the school that I attended. Anyway, for some reason, a couple of them kind of latched on to me. I've never known the reason. One was a huge kid. For our age, he was huge. I even remember their names. I won't mention it here other than their first name. One was Ben, the other one was Kenny. Ben was this tall black kid. I mean, very dark-skinned, really rough-looking, but very gentle. The other one was a real squirrely little kid, maybe biracial. I don't know for sure. Couldn't think it back that far. Very fast at everything that he was doing. Nothing was in slow motion. When he walked, he ran. When he did homework, he did it fast. Anyway, they became my two buddies. They became my protectorate, if you will, because on some occasion I was bullied because I couldn't speak the language. I couldn't respond to people adequately. Anyway, so, kind of as a side, I want to mention something here that maybe doesn't flow totally with the Gingold family. Well, when I was old enough, as a young adult, I tried to find where these two young men were. Ben, the big guy, I found out was in prison. I didn't know for what or for how long. And then the squirrely little guy, Kenny, I found out got 2 degrees in engineering from Marquette University and was on the United States Olympic team in track. So you kind of, I get kind of emotional that here you have 3 kids in one environment, but eventually get separated, that you just never know what the hell happens. So,
tell me about the education that you received.
Oh, I was very fortunate. Just as a reference point, even though my parents didn't have a lot of education, they pushed it very strongly. I think they had kind of, my mom at least told me she thought it was a Jewish philosophy, I don't know if it was or not, that education is one of the things that you always strive for as much as you can. You learn as much as you can. Because what you learn, whether you call it education or learning, no one can take away from you. They can take away your clothes, your food, your body even, but they can't take away that. I bought into that very heavily. My brother didn't. My older brother, he was interested in work and ladies. I was too young for the ladies yet. Okay. But anyway, so I was fortunate. I had great teachers in my mind. I got extra help. I went to every summer school that I could. But interestingly enough, when I finished junior high, the counselors weren't impressed with my English skills. So they recommended that I go maybe work with my hands rather than my brain. And of course, the irony was that I had to be the interpreter for the parent and teacher conferences for my parents, because they couldn't understand English. So I did the best I could. Anyway, I wound up going to a boys' trade and technical school called Boys Tech in Milwaukee to learn a trade because the counselor said, and I interpreted that to my parents, and they said, okay, go to Boys Tech for high school. So anyway, I went to Boys Tech, and I thought I got a pretty good education there. When I was finished my sophomore year, I think, at the high school, I talked with one of my teachers, and I said, maybe I don't want to be a carpenter or a plumber or an electrician or a draftsperson. Is there anything else that I might be able to do? And this, interestingly enough, was a teacher that was in the military reserve. He was a naval commander, I think. He said, well, maybe what you could do is get ready to go to a military academy. He was interested in that because he went to Annapolis himself. And he said, well, let's see what things you might want to do to get ready for that. And I didn't have a foggiest idea what he was talking about. He said, well, let me talk to the principal and see if we can get you to go part-time to another high school that has academics that we don't offer at this high school. So lo and behold, these two guys, the principal and this teacher, said, we found a high school that will take you for whatever time that you can get there to attend their class. So but the guarantee that I had to make, or promise that I had to make, is that I would attend every summer school that other high school had. So I said, sure. Who the heck? I didn't know any difference. I didn't have any real guidance. My parents didn't know the systems or anything. So I was very fortunate. I had some fantastic teachers at both high schools. So I would finish one high school at a certain time on certain days and take a bus to the other high school to attend their other classes. So I graduated from two high schools in Milwaukee.
What level of education did you achieve?
Well, I graduated from two high schools. And I was very fortunate that I was able to get a scholarship for most of my education. And I was fortunate enough to get 3 degrees from Wisconsin, 2 from Minnesota, and 1 from UCLA.
What were your degrees in?
Oh, well, let's not spend any time on that.
What was your profession?
I was a clinical psychologist and healthcare administrator. I was a hospital administrator.
Did you get married?
I did get married about 58 years ago to a lady that I met at the University of Wisconsin. Actually, she came to a party that I had at my apartment with other ladies, and we somehow hooked up.
What is her name?
Her name is Phyllis.
Was she a survivor?
No, she was not. She was born in Omaha, Nebraska.
Did you share your experiences with your wife?
No.
Do you have any children?
We had 4 children. Our oldest passed away when he was 51. We have 3 surviving children, 2 girls and 1 boy.
What are your children's names?
Okay, our oldest daughter is, her name is Shara. She's married and she has a couple of young women as teenagers or older teenagers. Um, and uh, and then we have Tamara, who has 3 boys, and then Jason, who's a bachelor.
Did you tell your children that you were a Holocaust survivor?
Not until recently. That happened pretty much when my older brother died. I was encouraged by my wife to talk about my past. And also I have a very good friend by the name of Dr. Brian Kahn, who was after me for a couple of years to talk about it. So when my brother died, I kind of said, well, I'm the last one of the Gingols. Let me try to do something positive.
What was their reaction?
In terms of the reaction by whom?
When you told your children about your wartime experiences?
Well, interestingly enough, they didn't show too much reaction to it. The only one that really paid some significant attention has been my youngest daughter, Tamara. And maybe because she's a teacher and has had different kinds of training than my other living kids. She has shown tremendous amount of interest because she has done some stuff jointly with me in terms of community education as well.
How many grandchildren do you have?
We have 6 grandchildren. My daughter Tamara has 3 boys. I always refer to them as jocks because they're all pretty muscular, husky kids.
What are their names?
The youngest is Johnny, who's a weightlifter and was a football player. And the next older one, his name is Chico, who was a superb soccer player, both in high school and continued in college. And the oldest one, Chico, is 20 now. The oldest one is Darian, and he's 27, and he's married. He's been married 3 years now. Then my daughter, my older daughter, has two daughters, and one just started as a freshman at the University of Wisconsin, Illinois. I should apologize to Wisconsin. As a freshman, and her name is Jenna. Her last name is Meisinger. My daughter Shara is married to her hubby, Phil Meisinger. And she has an older sister. Jenna has an older sister, Elena, who's a junior at the University of Wisconsin. And then I have a grandson. His name is Wiley, from my son Steve, who passed when he was 51. And Wiley is now, I think, about 23 years of age. So that's our Gingold troop at this point in time.
Did you ever experience any discrimination here in the United States?
Probably a little bit when I was in high school. I think it was in the form of some bullying. But I was a jock myself, so it didn't take my dealing with it was pretty quick. Let me put it that way. So that's the only real example that I can have of real anti-Semitism was a particular couple of kids in high school that I physically took care of.
Did you serve in the military?
Yes, I did. When I finished high school, I don't even remember, started my first year in college. I was on a scholarship to Wisconsin in engineering. I decided that I needed a break of some sort. So I signed up for the United States Army Reserve, and I served with them for 6 years.
Do you have any health issues that you attribute to your Holocaust experiences?
I don't think so. I think most of my health care issues are somewhat consistent with the aging process. I think they're also consistent with the physical activities that I was engaged in. I played football. I played paraprofessional or semi-professional soccer. And I was a competitive speed skater and racquetball player. So all of those contributed to a lot of wounds in terms of dislocated shoulders, broken bones, etc.
How often do you think about your Holocaust experiences?
Well, actually quite a bit. Recently, I should say. When I thought I took over my brother's mantle of community education, because I spent a lot of time going to schools and talking to school kids, mostly junior, senior high, sometimes university types. And I usually do that between 20 and 30 times a year, school year. So thoughts come to my mind a lot when I talk.
Do you ever experience nightmares?
No, I sleep extremely well, except my wife tells me I snore a lot, but that's the way it goes.
How do you feel about the state of Israel?
I'm mixed. I have mixed feelings. I've been to Israel twice. I think they're challenging some of the principles of Judaism at this point in time. And I don't like it personally, but there isn't much I can do with it from this perspective.
Do you practice Judaism today?
I'm a secular Jew. I believe in some of the underlying principles of Judaism, such as treat others the way you want to be treated, believe in God, maybe not all the details associated with that, equality, equity, social responsibility, some of those things.
Raising your children, did you celebrate Jewish holidays?
I have to say, kind of in a mix, yes and no. My wife is a driver of Jewish holidays. So I participate whenever my wife wants me to participate. But generally, if I'm left alone, I won't.
Did you apply for or receive any restitution?
No, neither applied or received.
Do you read books and see films about the Holocaust?
Yes.
How were you affected by Adolf Eichmann's trial?
At the time that occurred, I might have been in the military, so I really didn't have time to pay attention to it. But I don't think it affected me one way or another, other than I think it was dealt fairly, and I just leave it at that.
Have you ever returned to your hometown since you emigrated to this country?
Are you talking about Milwaukee or?
Poland.
Oh, Warsaw, Poland? I call Milwaukee as my hometown. I apologize. No, I have never returned to Warsaw, Poland. And I have no desire. For whatever reason, I don't know.
When did you find out, excuse me, when did you find out what happened to your Aunt Chava and Uncle Freund?
Yeah, this was interesting. This was, I was a young adult at that time. I don't know what age I was. But for some reason, my father started talking about wanting to find out about his relatives. And, and at that point, it was kind of a mixed message, because he never talked about it before that. And then one day he said, I found out some information that Chava and Freund are alive. And he said, I'll have to look into it more. But that's all I know at this point in time. And later he did check into it more. He also checked into trying to find his relatives in Argentina. He thought the likely places were Argentina and Israel, which made sense. And interestingly enough, he was able to locate Freund and my aunt. And he actually, shortly after he located him, he went to Israel. And I'm trying to think between what war it was. I don't remember. But it was between one of the wars that Israel was having, because he was standing on a tank, having his picture taken.
How many family members did you lose in the Holocaust?
Well, I really don't know for sure, but definitely my grandparents on both maternal and paternal side.
Do you know what happened to them?
No. No, like I said, my mother had a sister, older sister, because she went to see if my grandparents were okay, and she never came back. I don't know about my dad's family at all, with all honesty. He never talked about his parents. Only inkling I had is he said he had some brothers at one time, but he never went beyond that. And I'm sorry to say that I never pushed it.
Why did you come forward to share your story today?
Well, the last 4 years, as I indicated, I'm kind of the last survivor of the Gingold family. Apologize. Too quick of a drink. Sorry. Just 1 second. I guess 2 things, maybe 3 things, triggered, I guess, my interest. One is that I was the remaining Gingold of the core family of Gingolds, I guess, and that my brother was no longer around to do some of this stuff in terms of educate other people. So that was kind of one thing. The other was, I guess, I wouldn't call it nagging, but periodically my wife, Phyllis, would suggest to me that maybe I should try to educate other people. And the third, I think I mentioned, Dr. Brian Kahn, who taught with my wife as teachers. He is also a retired teacher, was after me for a couple of years after my brother died to join the Holocaust Education Center as part of his volunteer group, which did teacher education on the Holocaust. So he kind of pushed me for a couple of years, and I decided, well, all of these people, I think, have the right idea. So I said, okay. And since that time, I've spent a lot of time and energy going to schools primarily, trying to provide as much education as I can in a positive way without talking about the atrocities of the Holocaust. And I do that pretty frequently now. I probably hit maybe 1,000 kids a year in one form or another. And then I also kind of have goosed on, encouraged our Jewish Federation of Champaign-Urbana to be a little more aggressive in their outreach to educate the public about the Holocaust, other than Bill or Baruch Gingold going out to the schools. So we've been able to draw in a couple of very prominent exhibits. One is called Courage to Remember, which is, I think, an internationally traveled exhibit that we have for a couple of years here exhibiting. And our focus is the rural communities, to people that don't have any real knowledge or access to the Jewish people, to try to educate them. And we currently have that exhibit, interestingly enough, in a community called Gibson City. And the church, the Lutheran Church, is a host and sponsor of it in Gibson City, which is a community of 4,000 people about 40 miles from Champaign-Urbana. So we're trying to use as many mechanisms that are available to us, but I kind of push for in-person outreach kind of stuff whenever possible. Good, bad, or indifferent, that's what I do.
What is your greatest triumph over Hitler?
Well, I think the fact that the Gingolds survived and are able to have a progeny and do what we can to educate.
What would you like to tell future generations?
Well, pretty much what my mom told me in different ways. Uh, Learn as much as you can. And kind of believe in your social principles and human rights principles. Those aren't the exact words my mom used, but somewhere in that geographic area.
Thank you, Bill.